The detective secretly follows a black girl alone in the park, and when he sees the suffering on her face and hears about her mother's situation, he starts to cry. The morning sun seeped through the gaps in the shutters of Richard Sterling's office at the top of a skyscraper in Manhattan. The 35-year-old tycoon watched the city below, a landscape of concrete and glass that reflected his own heart, cold and impenetrable. His blue-gray eyes, normally calculating, were now clouded with worry. Richard ran a hand through his impeccably combed dark hair, a rare gesture of nervousness. His assistant, Marcus, quietly entered the room, carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Sterling, here are the profiles you requested." Richard nodded, taking the folder. "Thank you, Marcus. Any news about the meeting with the investors?" "Yes, sir. They've confirmed it for next month, but—" Marcus hesitated. "But what?" Richard asked, his tone sharp. "They've expressed concerns about your personal life, sir. Apparently, your reputation as an inveterate bachelor is causing concern." Richard cursed softly. It was exactly what he feared. The conservative investors he needed to impress valued family stability as much as the numbers on the balance sheet. His analytical mind was already formulating a plan. "Marcus, cancel my appointments for this afternoon. I have an idea." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a small apartment in the Bronx, 28-year-old Emily Carter was startled awake by the shrill sound of her alarm clock. Her green eyes, still heavy with sleep, focused on the clock, 5:30 in the morning. "Damn," she muttered, jumping out of bed. Another busy day was beginning. Emily got ready quickly, her long brown hair tied up in a messy ponytail. She put on her uniform from the cafe where she worked and ran to the kitchen. There, she found her younger sister, Lily, 16, preparing breakfast. "Hey, sleepyhead," Lily joked. "I thought you were going to be late again." Emily smiled, picking up a piece of toast. "No way. I can't afford to lose this job." The sisters exchanged worried glances. The family's financial situation had been precarious ever since their mother had fallen ill. Medical bills were piling up, and Emily was working 2 jobs to keep things afloat. "How's Mom?" Emily asked, swallowing her coffee quickly. "The same," Lily replied, her smile faltering. "The doctor said she needs a new treatment, but it costs a fortune," Emily added, sighing. "Don't worry, Lil, we'll manage." With a quick kiss on her sister's forehead, Emily ran off to catch the subway. During the journey, her thoughts oscillated between worry and determination. She would do anything to help her family. The day at the cafe went as usual: rushed customers, confused orders, and scarce tips. Emily kept a smile on her face, but inside, anxiety consumed her. That's when he walked in. Richard Sterling, impeccable in his Armani suit, looked out of place in the modest cafe. His eyes roamed the place until they settled on Emily. He approached the counter, an enigmatic smile on his lips. "Emily Carter?" he asked. Emily frowned in surprise. "Yes, it's me. Can I help you?" "Actually, I think we can help each other," Richard replied, his voice soft but firm. "I have a proposition for you." Intrigued and a little apprehensive, Emily followed him to a separate table. Richard laid out his plan. He needed someone to pretend to be his fiancée during an important social event, someone who could charm conservative investors with a convincing love story. "Why me?" Emily asked, still stunned. "You have a quality that can't be faked, authenticity," Richard replied, his eyes piercing. "What's more, I'm offering generous compensation, enough to cover your mother's medical debts and guarantee your sister's future." Emily's heart raced. It was madness, complete insanity. But the words medical debts and her sister's future echoed in her mind. "What if I say no?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Richard smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then I'll find someone else. But I doubt that anyone else needs this opportunity as much as you do, Emily." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, weighing up her options. When she opened them again, there was a new determination in her gaze. "All right, Mr. Sterling, I accept." Richard held out his hand, sealing the deal with a firm shake. "Good. We'll begin preparations immediately." As Emily watched Richard leave the cafe, she couldn't help but wonder what exactly she had gotten herself into. A mixture of hope and apprehension stirred in her chest. Little did she know that this decision would change the course of her life forever, dragging her into a world of luxury, intrigue, and, perhaps, unexpected love. Fate had rolled its dice, and now Emily and Richard were about to embark on a journey that would test not only their ability to deceive, but also their own conceptions of love, loyalty, and the true meaning of success. The cool night air seemed to carry a mixture of promise and challenge as she walked slowly through the busy city streets. The image of Richard disappearing into the crowd still echoed in her mind, like a foretaste of what was to come. The city lights flashed around her, and each step took her further away from her old life and closer to the unknown. When she finally reached the grandiose facade of the Plaza Hotel, a sense of surreality enveloped her. She was about to enter a new world, a new life. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glowed with the golden light of hundreds of candles, reflected in the crystals of the chandeliers and the champagne glasses. New York's elite circulated around the room, a sea of gala dresses and expensive suits. At the center of it all, Emily Carter felt like Alice in Wonderland, dazzled and completely out of her element. The contrast between her restlessness in the cafe and the dazzling reception at the hotel clearly outlined the new chapter that was beginning in her life. She nervously adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck, a generous loan from Richard for the occasion. The navy blue dress she was wearing, although elegant and perfectly fitted, seemed to weigh a ton. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "Relax." Richard's voice sounded soft in her ear, his hand resting gently on her back. "You're doing great." Emily turned to face him, surprised by the kindness in his normally cold eyes. For a moment, she almost forgot that the whole thing was a farce. "I feel like a fraud," she whispered, guilt weighing heavily on her chest. Richard leaned closer, his expensive perfume enveloping her. "You're the only real person in this room, Emily. Use that to your advantage." Before she could reply, they were approached by a middle-aged couple. The man, with gray hair and an affable smile, extended his hand to Richard. "Sterling, what a pleasure to see you here," he exclaimed, before turning his attention to Emily. "And who is this lovely young lady?" Richard smiled, his arm wrapping around Emily's waist in a possessive gesture that took her by surprise. "George, Margaret, allow me to introduce my fiancée, Emily Carter. Emily, this is George and Margaret Hawthorne, some of our most important investors." Emily felt the weight of the moment. This was the test, the reason she was there. Taking a deep breath, she smiled and held out her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she said, her voice firmer than she had expected. Margaret Hawthorne looked at her with critical eyes. "Carter? I don't remember any Carter families in our circle." Emily's heart raced, but before panic could set in, she remembered Richard's advice. "Be real." "Oh no, I'm not from that circle," Emily laughed softly. "Actually, I grew up in the Bronx. My father was a mechanic and my mother was a nurse." Margaret's eyes widened in surprise, while George looked puzzled. Richard, next to her, tensed up, but Emily continued. "I met Richard when he came into the cafe where I worked. He ordered a double espresso and ended up winning my heart," she smiled, looking at Richard with a tenderness that surprised them both. Margaret softened her expression. "What a lovely story." And how are you adjusting to all this? She made a sweeping gesture towards the luxurious salon. Emily laughed again, this time with genuine amusement. Honestly, it's a bit scary. Yesterday, I was worried about paying the rent, and today I'm wearing a necklace that probably costs more than my apartment. George let out a hearty laugh. Oh, how refreshing. Richard, you found a rare gem here. Richard, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of surprise and admiration, nodded. Yes, I really have. As the evening progressed, Emily found herself the center of attention. Her disarming honesty and natural charm captivated the guests. She shared stories about her childhood in the Bronx, about the challenges of caring for her sick mother and younger sister. Instead of pity, her stories inspired respect and admiration. "And how did you manage to keep your family together during such difficult times?" asked an elderly woman, her eyes sparkling with interest. Emily smiled, a smile that lit up her whole face, with love, determination, and many sleepless nights. But it's those hard times that show us what we're really made of. Across the room, Richard watched Emily with growing fascination. She was a revelation, turning what should have been a farce into something genuine and touching. The investors he was so keen to impress were completely enchanted by her. Victor Lang, one of the most influential and notoriously skeptical investors, approached Richard. "Your fiancée is amazing, Sterling," he commented, his shrewd eyes fixed on Emily. "Where exactly did you find her?" Richard felt a twinge of concern but kept his expression neutral. As she said in a cafe, "Sometimes you find the greatest treasures in the most unexpected places." Victor raised an eyebrow. "No doubt, she certainly seems to have brought a new perspective to your life." Meanwhile, Emily stepped away for a moment, seeking a moment of tranquility. She found herself on a secluded balcony, the cool New York night air a welcome change from the heat of the lounge. "You're doing incredibly well," Richard's voice surprised her. He joined her on the balcony, offering her a glass of champagne. Emily accepted the drink, taking a sip before replying. "Thank you. I didn't expect it to be like this." "How did you expect it to be?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. Emily looked down at the city that stretched out below them, the lights twinkling like earthly stars. "I thought I'd have to pretend to be someone I'm not, but instead, I feel like for the first time in a long time, I'm really being myself." Richard watched her, noticing how the moonlight softened her features, highlighting a beauty that went beyond the physical. "You're extraordinary, Emily," he said softly. "You've turned this evening into something real." Their gazes met, and for a moment, the farce that bound them seemed to fade. Emily felt her heart racing, not from nervousness this time, but from something deeper, more dangerous. The moment was interrupted by the sound of someone clearing their throat. They turned to see Victor Lang standing in the doorway, an enigmatic smile on his lips. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said, his tone soft but his eyes sharp. "Emily, dear, your guests are clamoring for more of your charming stories." Emily smiled, although a shiver of apprehension ran down her spine. There was something in Victor's gaze that made her uncomfortable. "Of course, Mr. Lang. We don't want to disappoint you, do we?" She cast one last glance at Richard before following Victor back into the lounge. Richard stood back for a moment, watching her walk away. A strange feeling settled in his chest, a mixture of pride, admiration, and something else he wasn't yet ready to name. The evening continued, with Emily charming everyone with her authenticity and Richard watching, increasingly aware that what had started out as a calculated plan was turning into something much more complex and potentially dangerous for his carefully guarded heart. As the last guests said their goodbyes, Effusively praising Richard's lovely bride, Emily felt the weight of the evening fall on her shoulders. She had successfully navigated a world that was not her own, but at what cost? The lies, although interwoven with truths, weighed heavily on her conscience. Richard led her out of the hotel where a limousine was waiting for them. When the doors closed, isolating them from the outside world, a heavy silence fell between them. "You were incredible tonight," Richard finally said, his voice low and intense. Emily looked at him, surprised by the emotion she saw in his normally impassive eyes. "Thank you," she replied softly. "But Richard, what happens now?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was fully prepared to face. Richard took Emily's hand in his, a gesture that surprised them both with its intimacy. "Now," he said, "we move on, and maybe we'll discover that there's more to this partnership than we initially thought." As the limousine glided through the streets of New York, Emily felt she was on the threshold of something new and frightening. The world she knew was changing, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the transformations to come. But looking at Richard, seeing the newfound vulnerability in his eyes, she knew there was no turning back. For better or worse, their lives were now irrevocably intertwined. The journey to Richard's penthouse felt like a blur. The city that never sleeps seemed like a distant backdrop as she gazed at her reflection in the glass of the limousine. The flickering lights reflected her uncertainty and the glow of anticipation. As the car came to a stop, a mixture of excitement and fear ran through her body. She was about to step through a portal into an unknown world, a stage for which she felt completely unprepared. The morning sun seeped through the silk curtains of Richard's penthouse guest room, waking Emily from a restless sleep. For a moment, she was disoriented, the luxury around her in stark contrast to the simplicity she was used to. The reality of her situation hit her like a wave. She was living a life that wasn't her own. Emily stood up, her feet sinking into the soft carpet. She walked over to the window, opening the curtains to reveal a panoramic view of Manhattan. Down below, the city was already pulsing with life, indifferent to the dramas unfolding above. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Miss Carter?" Clara's voice sounded from the other side. "Mr. Sterling asked me to inform you that breakfast is being served on the terrace." "Thank you, Clara. I'll be there in a moment," Emily replied, her voice still hoarse from sleep. She dressed carefully, opting for a simple dress she had brought from home, a small rebellion against the extravagant closet Richard had provided. Looking in the mirror, Emily barely recognized the woman who stared back at her. Her eyes, normally bright and optimistic, were clouded with doubt. On the terrace, Richard was already sitting, reading the financial newspaper while drinking coffee. He looked up when Emily approached, an automatic smile forming on his lips. "Good morning, Emily. I hope you slept well." Emily nodded, taking a seat at the table. "Yes, thank you. The room is very comfortable." An uncomfortable silence settled between them as Emily poured herself a cup of coffee. Richard watched her over the newspaper, noticing her choice of clothes and the tension in her shoulders. "Are you all right?" he finally asked, putting the newspaper aside. Emily hesitated, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. I don't know. This is all so different from what I'm used to. I feel like I'm losing my identity." Richard frowned, a wrinkle of concern forming between his eyebrows. "Emily, remember that this is temporary. You're doing an amazing job, and as soon as everything is sorted out, you can get back to your normal life." Richard's words, although well-meaning, caused Emily a pang of pain. Back to her normal life? After experiencing this world of luxury and opportunity, how could she just go back? "What if I don't want to go back?" she whispered, more to herself than to Richard. Richard stared at her, surprised. What do you mean? Emily sighed, finally finding the courage to express her inner conflicts. Richard, I grew up fighting for every penny, dreaming of a better life for my family. Now, I'm living that life, even if it's a farce. How can I just turn it off and go back to my reality? Richard leaned forward, his intense eyes fixed on hers. Emily, you don't have to turn anything off. What you've achieved here, people's admiration and respect, that's real. It's the fruit of your authenticity, not money or status. Richard's words touched Emily deeply, but also increased her confusion. She stood up abruptly, walking to the edge of the terrace. But what about my family? My sister, my mother? They depend on me. How can I reconcile this new world with the responsibilities I have? Richard joined her, keeping a respectful distance. Maybe it's not a question of choosing one or the other. Maybe it's about finding a balance. Emily looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. For a moment, she glimpsed a side of Richard that few knew, a side that intrigued and frightened her at the same time. The moment was interrupted by the ringing of Emily's cell phone. It was Lily, her sister. With an apologetic look at Richard, she answered. Hey, Lil, what's up? Lily's voice sounded worried on the other end of the line. Em, where are you? You didn't come home last night, and the cafe called asking why you didn't show up for the morning shift. Emily closed her eyes, guilt consuming her. In the excitement of recent events, she had completely forgotten her everyday responsibilities. I'm sorry, Lil. I'm working on a special project. I'll explain everything when I get home, okay? After reassuring her sister and hanging up, Emily turned to Richard, the conflict evident on her face. I have to go, she said, her voice shaking. My family, they need me. Richard nodded, understanding. Of course, but Emily, remember, you're not alone in this. If you need anything for yourself or your family, please let me know. Emily stared at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Thank you, Richard. I'll be back for the next event. As Emily prepared to leave, Richard watched her, a mixture of admiration and concern in his eyes. He was beginning to realize that what had started out as a simple business arrangement was turning into something much more complex and potentially dangerous for both of them. Back at her apartment in the Bronx, Emily was greeted by a tight hug from Lily. Em, we were so worried, Lily exclaimed, pulling her sister inside. Emily smiled, trying to mask her guilt. I'm sorry, sweetheart. It's been a crazy week. Her mother, Sarah, was sitting in the armchair in the living room, her face pale but her eyes shining with joy at the sight of her daughter. Emily, darling, I'm so glad you're home. Emily knelt down beside her mother, holding her frail hand. Mom, how are you feeling? Sarah smiled weakly. Better now that you're here. But Emily, you seem different. Has something happened? Emily hesitated, the weight of her secret weighing heavily on her chest. How could she explain the double life she was leading? How could she justify the lies even if they were for their own good? I got a new job, she finally said, opting for a half-truth. It's a great opportunity, but it demands a lot of my time. Lily frowned, noticing the hesitation in her sister's voice. What kind of job, Em? And why are you dressed like that? Emily looked down at her dress, suddenly aware of how out of place it seemed in her modest apartment. It's a corporate events job. I have to dress accordingly. Sarah watched her daughter intently, her motherly eyes noticing more than Emily would have liked. Emily, darling, you know you can tell us anything, don't you? Emily's heart squeezed. She desperately wanted to share everything. The deal with Richard, the glamour of the events, the conflict she felt. But how could she expose her family to the risk and uncertainty of her situation. "I know, Mom," she replied, forcing a smile. "And I promise I'll tell you everything when the time is right." That night, lying in her single bed, Emily stared at the ceiling, her heart torn between two worlds. On the one hand, the comfort and familiarity of her life in the Bronx, with all its struggles and unconditional love. On the other, the bright world full of possibilities that Richard had opened up to her. She picked up her cell phone, looking at Richard's last message. "I hope you got home okay. Remember, I'm here if you need anything." Emily closed her eyes, a solitary tear running down her cheek. How could she choose between her family and the new opportunities that were opening up? How could she keep her essence while navigating a world so different from her own? With these questions echoing in her mind, Emily finally fell asleep, her dreams a confusing mix of luxurious ballrooms and familiar Bronx streets. As she slept, she didn't realize that her transformation had already begun, and that the challenges she would face would be far greater than she had ever imagined. As the darkness of night settled in, New York City continued to pulse with life, indifferent to the emotional turmoil of its inhabitants. At the top of one of the skyscrapers that define its silhouette, Richard Sterling was in his office, a space that now seemed more like a refuge than a workplace. Dusk bathed the horizon in a spectacle of colors, reflecting the inner turmoil that Richard was trying to disguise. The glass of whiskey in his hand remained untouched, his focus not on business but on Emily Carter, the woman who had unexpectedly captured his heart and thoughts. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Richard watched the city from the top of his office, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. His thoughts, normally focused on numbers and strategies, were now consumed by one person, Emily Carter. He closed his eyes, remembering her smile, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about her family. It was a light he had never seen in his cold, calculating business world. Richard took a sip of whiskey, feeling the liquid burn his throat. What was happening to him? A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus, his assistant, entered with a folder in his hand. "Mr. Sterling, here are the reports you requested on Miss Carter's background." Richard hesitated before taking the folder. Part of him wanted to know everything about Emily. Another part felt guilty for invading her privacy. "Thank you, Marcus," he said, placing the folder on the table without opening it. "You can go home now." Alone again, Richard fought the urge to dive into the information about Emily. Instead, he picked up his phone and, before he could think twice, dialed her number. Emily was in her small apartment in the Bronx, helping her mother get into bed when her phone rang. Seeing Richard's name on the screen, she felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement. "Hello?" she answered, leaving the room so as not to disturb her mother. "Emily." Richard's voice sounded softer than usual. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, you're not," she replied, taking a seat on the worn sofa in the living room. "Is everything all right?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I wanted to know how you were. After our last meeting, I was worried." Emily's heart raced. It was the first time Richard had shown genuine concern for her, outside the context of his business. "I'm fine," she said, her voice betraying a little emotion. "It's hard to balance everything, but I'm dealing with it." Richard closed his eyes, imagining Emily in her small apartment, so different from the luxurious world he was used to. "Emily, I know I've asked a lot of you. If you need anything—" "Richard," she interrupted him gently, "why are you really calling?" The question took Richard by surprise. He found himself at a loss for words, something rare for a man known for his eloquence in business. I don't know," he finally admitted. "I guess I just wanted to hear your voice." The silence that followed was full of unspoken emotions. Emily felt her heart squeeze, torn between the attraction she felt for Richard and the fear of getting too involved in a world that wasn't her own. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling, "what are we doing? This wasn't supposed to be real." Richard stood up, walking over to the window. The city below seemed small and insignificant compared to the whirlwind of emotions in his chest. "I know," he replied softly. "But Emily, you've changed something in me. For the first time in years, I'm questioning everything I thought was important." Richard's words hit Emily like waves, making her shiver. She looked around her small apartment, at the family photos on the walls, at the worn furniture full of memories. How could she reconcile this world with Richard's? "I'm confused too, Richard," she admitted. "You've opened up a whole new world for me, shown me possibilities I never imagined. But I'm afraid of losing who I am." Richard felt a pang of guilt. He had dragged Emily into his world without fully considering the consequences for her. "Emily, you're the most authentic person I've ever met," he said fervently. "Don't let anything, not even me, change that." Silent tears streamed down Emily's face. What if it's too late? What if I'm already changing? The vulnerability in Emily's voice awakened something deep in Richard. He realized that he didn't just want their business deal. He wanted to get to know her truly, to understand her struggles and her dreams. "Then we change together," he said softly. "Emily, I want to know your world as much as you know mine. Can I visit you tomorrow?" The proposal took Emily by surprise. Richard Sterling, the Wall Street tycoon, wanting to visit her humble apartment in the Bronx. "Are you sure?" she asked, uncertain. "Absolutely," Richard replied without hesitation. They agreed on the details, and when they hung up, they both felt that something fundamental had changed between them. The next morning, Richard found himself standing in front of Emily's building, feeling strangely nervous. He, who had negotiated millions without blinking, now hesitated in front of an apartment door. Emily opened the door, her eyes widening as she saw Richard in simple jeans and a polo shirt, an obvious attempt to dress more casually. "Hi," she said, a shy smile on her lips. "Come in." Richard entered, his eyes roaming the small apartment. It was modest, yes, but there was a feeling of home that his luxurious penthouse never had. "It's cozy," he commented sincerely. Emily relaxed a little, grateful for his reaction. "Thank you. It's not much, but it's home." At that moment, Lily came out of her room, stopping abruptly when she saw Richard. Who are you?" she began, her eyes widening in recognition. "Wait, you're Richard Sterling." Richard smiled, holding out his hand to Lily. "And you must be Lily. Emily talks about you a lot." Lily looked from Richard to Emily, her expression a mixture of confusion and excitement. You didn't tell me you knew Richard Sterling." Emily blushed, feeling caught between her two worlds. "It's complicated, Lil." The tension was broken by Sarah's weak voice coming from the bedroom. "Emily? Who's there?" Emily cast a worried glance at Richard before answering. "It's a friend, Mom. Can I bring him to meet you?" With Sarah's permission, Emily led Richard into his mother's room. Richard felt a lump in his throat at the sight of the frail woman on the bed, but was greeted with a warm smile. "So, you're the famous Richard," Sarah said, her voice weak but warm. "Emily's been talking about you a lot." Richard was surprised by the emotion he felt. Here was a family united by love, facing adversity together. It was something he, with all his money and power, had never really experienced. They spent the morning talking, Richard listening intently to the Carter family's stories. He laughed at Lily's jokes, was touched by Sarah's strength, and found himself increasingly enchanted by Emily. When it was time to leave, Richard felt transformed. In the elevator, he turned to Emily, his eyes shining with new understanding. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing me what really matters." Emily smiled, feeling that something had changed between them. It was no longer just a business arrangement. It was the start of something deeper, truer. As Richard walked back to his car, he knew that his life would never be the same again. Emily Carter had entered his world as part of a plan, but now she was becoming the center of something much bigger. Back in her apartment, Emily sat on her bed, her emotions in turmoil. She picked up her diary, a habit she had kept since she was a teenager, and began to write. "Dear Diary, today Richard Sterling entered my world, and I think for the first time he really saw me. Not the Emily I pretended to be at events, but the real me. And the scariest thing? I think I'm starting to see the real Richard too. What does this mean for us? For our deal? For my heart? Only time will tell." She closed the diary, looking out of the window at the city that never sleeps. Somewhere out there, Richard was also contemplating the future, both of them knowing that their lives had become intertwined in a way that neither of them could have predicted. The surrounding city was a constant reminder of the endless possibilities and hidden dangers. As the night wore on, the lights of Manhattan continued to shine, each of which could be the flame of a new story or a new challenge. A few kilometers away, on the 50th floor of a skyscraper that cut through the night sky, another drama was unfolding, far from the public eye. Victor Lang's office was a veritable sanctuary of power and control. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the same city that Emily was contemplating, but Victor's perspective was imbued with ambition and calculation. Sitting comfortably behind his desk, his eyes were not admiring the view, but fixed on his computer screen, where the image of Emily Carter smiled innocently. He observed every detail with the precision of a predator assessing its prey. Victor Lang's office, on the 50th floor of a skyscraper in Manhattan, was a monument to power and ambition. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, but Victor's shrewd eyes were fixed on his computer screen, where a photo of Emily Carter smiled innocently. Victor leaned back in his leather chair, a cold smile playing on his lips. Something about Richard Sterling's fiancée didn't fit, and Victor Lang was known for his ability to detect lies and exploit weaknesses. "Miss Dawson," he called to his assistant over the intercom. "Schedule a meeting with our private investigator. I have a job for him." Meanwhile, in a cozy cafe on the Lower East Side, Emily and Richard were sitting at a discreet table, cups of steaming coffee between them. It was the first time they had met in a public place without the pretense of being a couple, and the atmosphere was charged with nervousness and anticipation. Emily stirred her spoon absent-mindedly, her eyes meeting Richard's briefly before darting away again. "So," she began, trying to break the uncomfortable silence, "how were the reactions after the event?" Richard smiled, relaxing a little. "Incredible. The investors can't stop talking about you. Emily, you've really impressed them." A faint blush tinged Emily's cheeks. "I was just myself," she murmured. "Exactly," Richard replied, his voice soft. "That's what makes you so special." Emily's eyes widened at the intensity in Richard's gaze. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear, and Emily felt her heart racing. The moment was broken by the shrill sound of Richard's cell phone. He looked at the screen and frowned. "It's Victor Lang," he said, a tone of concern in his voice. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something in Victor's calculating gaze during the event that made her uncomfortable. Richard answered the call, his expression becoming increasingly serious as the conversation progressed. When he hung up, his eyes met Emily's, full of concern. Victor wants to set up a meeting. Just with me, Richard explained. He mentioned having some questions about our relationship. Fear settled in Emily's chest. Do you think he suspects something? Richard reached across the table, taking Emily's hand. The gesture, while comforting, also sent an electric current through her arm. Don't worry. Victor's been known to play mind games. I'll deal with it. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. In the days that followed, Emily found herself torn between two worlds. During the day, she continued her routine in the Bronx, looking after her mother and helping Lily with her studies. In the evenings, she met up with Richard, preparing for upcoming events and increasingly simply enjoying each other's company. It was during one of these evening meetings, as they walked through Central Park under the soft light of the street lamps, that Emily realized that her feelings for Richard had turned into something deeper than she had ever imagined. "Richard," she said softly, stopping near a bench, "we need to talk about this." She gestured vaguely between them. Richard looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Emily, But before he could continue, his phone rang again. It was Marcus, his assistant, with urgent news. "Mr. Sterling, I've just received an alert. Someone is investigating Miss Carter's past. It seems to be a private investigator hired by Victor Lang." Richard's face paled. He looked at Emily, who was watching his expression with growing concern. "What is it?" she asked, her heart hammering in her chest. Richard hung up the phone, his mind racing to find a solution. "Emily, Victor has hired someone to investigate you." The fear that Emily had been suppressing exploded in her chest. "Oh God," she whispered, sitting down heavily on the bench. "Richard, what if he finds out the truth? My family, they can't be dragged into this." Richard knelt in front of her, holding her hands. "I won't let that happen, Emily. I promise." But even as he made the promise, Richard knew they were entering dangerous waters. Victor Lang was known for his ruthlessness in business, and if he found out the truth about their deal, the consequences would be disastrous. The next day, Richard found himself in Victor's office, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. "Richard, my friend," Victor began, his smile not reaching his eyes, "I must say, your fiancée is a fascinating creature." Richard kept his expression neutral. "Emily is really special." Victor leaned forward, his eyes penetrating. "Yes, so special that she seems to have come out of nowhere. Curious, don't you think?" Richard felt his heart racing, but years of tough negotiations had trained him well. "Love has a way of surprising us, Victor. I'm sure you understand that." Victor laughed, a cold sound that sent shivers down Richard's spine. "Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand that there's more to this story than you're telling me." Meanwhile, in her small apartment in the Bronx, Emily paced back and forth, anxiety consuming her. She had told Lily an edited version of the truth, explaining that she was helping Richard with a business project, but omitting the more complicated details. Lily said softly, watching her sister with concern. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Emily stopped, looking at her younger sister. At that moment, she felt older than ever. "Honestly, Lil, I'm not sure about anything else." The sound of a knock on the door made both sisters jump. Emily opened the door to find a man in a suit with a private investigator's badge. "Miss Carter?" he asked, his voice professional. "I have some questions about your relationship with Richard Sterling." Emily's world seemed to slow down. She could feel Lily's confused gaze on her back, the weight of her lies threatening to crush her. At that moment, Emily realized that she was at a crossroads. Her choices now would not only affect her, but everyone she loved. With a heavy heart, she did the only thing she could. She invited the investigator in. Meanwhile, in Victor's office, the conversation between him and Richard had turned into a game of verbal chess, each trying to anticipate the other's moves. "You know, Richard," Victor said, twirling an expensive pen between his fingers, "I've always admired your business acumen, but I wonder if this time you haven't gone too far." Richard kept his composure, but internally he was panicking. He needed to protect Emily, his family, and yes, even himself. "Victor," Richard began, his voice firm, "whatever you think you've discovered." But Victor interrupted him with an abrupt gesture. "What I have discovered, my dear friend, is that you are playing a dangerous game, and I love dangerous games." Victor's smile was predatory, and Richard felt genuine fear for the first time in years, not for himself, but for Emily and what his actions could cost her. As night fell over New York, three souls found themselves at a crossroads of lies, love, and ambition. Emily, facing the incisive questions of the investigator, Richard, locked in a verbal duel with Victor, and Victor, relishing the power he believed he had over both of them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change their lives forever. The truth, hidden for so long, was about to come out, and with it, the potential for destruction or redemption. Dusk painted the New York sky in shades of orange and purple, an ephemeral beauty that contrasted dramatically with the emotional storm raging inside the modest apartment in the Bronx. Emily Carter was sitting on her worn sofa, staring at the private investigator with a mixture of fear and determination in her green eyes. "Miss Carter," the investigator began, his tone professional but not without a hint of compassion, "I understand that this is a delicate situation, but I need you to be honest with me. What exactly is the nature of your relationship with Richard Sterling?" Emily felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. Beside her, Lily held her hand, offering silent support. The air in the small apartment felt thick, heavy with the weight of secrets about to be revealed. Emily began, her voice shaky. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, there was a new resolve in her gaze. "The truth is, Richard and I aren't really engaged." The investigator raised an eyebrow but didn't seem surprised. "Go on," he encouraged gently. And so, like a dam that finally gives way under the pressure, Emily let the truth flow out. She told him about the initial agreement, about how it all began as a business arrangement. But as she spoke, Emily realized that she was revealing not only the facts, but also the feelings that had grown, unexpected and powerful, between her and Richard. "I never wanted to deceive anyone," she concluded, silent tears running down her cheeks. "Especially my family. I just wanted to help them, to give them a better life." Lily, who had listened in shock, hugged her sister. "Oh, Em," she whispered, "why didn't you tell us?" The investigator watched the scene with a thoughtful expression. "Miss Carter, do you understand the implications of what you're telling me?" Emily nodded, wiping away her tears. "Yes, I do. But I can't live with this lie any longer. No matter what happens to me, I need to protect my family and Richard." Meanwhile, in the heart of Manhattan, Victor Lang's office was the scene of an equally intense confrontation. Richard Sterling, normally the epitome of confidence and control, felt cornered. "So, Richard," Victor smiled, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes, "why don't you tell me the truth about your lovely fiancée? Or should I say, your hired actress?" Richard felt his stomach sink. He knew this moment would come, but still, the reality was brutal. "Victor, whatever you think you know." "Oh, I know everything," Victor interrupted, his voice laden with triumph. "I know about the deal. I know about the farce. What puzzles me is why you, Richard Sterling, the Wall Street shark, would stoop to such a scheme." Richard was silent for a moment, weighing up his options. He could deny everything. He could try to bluff his way out of this situation. But then Emily's image came to mind. Her honesty, her integrity, the way she made him want to be a better person. "You're right, Victor," Richard finally said, his voice low but firm. "Emily and I weren't really engaged. Initially, it was a business arrangement." Victor leaned forward, savoring his victory. "Ah, finally the truth. What now, Richard? What do you think your precious investors will say when they find out they've been duped?" Richard stared at Victor, a new determination in his eyes. "They'll know the truth, because I'm going to tell them." Victor laughed in disbelief. "You? The man who built an empire based on half-truths and manipulation? Do you really expect me to believe that you're going to confess everything?" "Believe what you want, Victor," Richard replied, standing up. "But I've changed. Emily, she showed me that there's more to life than power and money. She showed me the value of honesty, of family, of true love." Victor watched Richard with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. "Love? Don't tell me you really fell in love with that waitress from the Bronx?" Richard smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face in a way Victor had never seen before. "Yes, Victor, I fell in love, and that's why I can't go on with this farce any longer." As Richard left Victor's office, determined to right his wrongs, Emily was coming to a similar decision in her Bronx apartment. "I need to talk to Richard," she said, standing up abruptly. "We need to end this once and for all." The investigator nodded, an expression of respect on his face. "Miss Carter, I must warn you that the consequences of your actions could be severe." Emily looked at her family, at Lily, at her mother who was now standing in the bedroom doorway, having overheard part of the conversation. "I know, but I can't live with lies anymore. My family deserves the truth, and Richard, well, him too." With renewed determination, Emily grabbed her coat and headed for the door. But before she could leave, the sound of a firm knock surprised her. When she opened the door, her heart almost stopped. Richard was standing there panting as if he had run all the way to the Bronx. His eyes, normally cold and calculating, were full of emotion. "Emily," he said, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." Fate, it seemed, had decided it was time for all the truths to come out. Emily stepped aside, allowing Richard to enter. The small apartment now seemed even smaller, filled with tension and anticipation. Richard looked around, noticing the investigator, Lily, and Emily's mother. His gaze finally settled on Emily, and at that moment all pretenses and masks fell away. "I told Victor everything," Richard said, his voice low but firm. "And now I want to tell everyone the truth. No more lies, no more games." Emily felt tears forming in her eyes, a mixture of relief and fear. "I was about to do the same," she admitted. Richard took Emily's hands in his, ignoring the surprised looks around them. "Emily, what started out as a business arrangement has turned into something I never expected. I fell in love with you, your honesty, your strength, your heart." A stunned silence fell over the apartment. Lily put her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide. Emily's mother leaned on the door, watching the scene with a mixture of shock and understanding. Emily looked into Richard's eyes, seeing in them a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Richard, I fell in love with you too. But how can we build something real on a foundation of lies?" Richard nodded, understanding. "You're right. That's why tomorrow, at the final event with the investors, I'm going to tell them the whole truth. No matter what the consequences, they deserve to know. Everyone deserves to know." The investigator, who had been watching everything in silence, finally spoke. "Mr. Sterling, Miss Carter, Do you understand that your actions could have serious legal and financial repercussions? Richard turned to face him. We do. But some things are more important than money or reputation. Truth, love, integrity. Those are the things that really matter. Emily squeezed Richard's hand, feeling a wave of courage run through her body. We'll face whatever comes together, she said, her voice firm. As night fell over New York, two souls who had met in the most unlikely circumstances were now united in a common purpose. Tomorrow would bring challenges, trials, and possibly the ruin of everything they had built. But at that moment, in the small living room in the Bronx, there was also hope. Hope that the truth, however painful, could be the foundation of something new and genuine. The stage was set for the final showdown, where secrets would be revealed, hearts would be tested, and Richard and Emily's true character would be exposed for all to see. The fate of their love, their careers, and their lives hung by a thread, but for the first time, they would face everything honestly and united. The morning of the decisive event dawned with a crystal blue sky over New York, as if the universe itself was offering a clear stage for the drama that was about to unfold. In Richard Sterling's apartment, the silence was palpable as he prepared, every movement deliberate and loaded with meaning. Richard adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, his eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and apprehension. It wasn't just his career that was at stake today, but something far more precious: his newfound integrity and the chance of a future with Emily. "Are you ready for this, boss?" Marcus asked, entering the room with a folder of documents. Richard turned around, a tense smile on his lips. "As ready as I can be to potentially destroy everything I've built." Marcus, who had been a silent witness to his boss's transformation over the last few weeks, put a reassuring hand on Richard's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, and whatever the outcome, I'll be by your side." In the Bronx, Emily was facing her own internal battle as she got ready. Lily helped her get dressed, the silence between the sisters charged with unspoken emotions. "Em," Lily finally spoke, her voice soft. "Are you sure about this? There's no going back afterwards." Emily met her sister's gaze in the mirror, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I am, Lil. I've spent so long trying to protect our family that I've almost lost sight of who I really am. Today, no matter what, I'm going to stay true to myself." Her mother, Sarah, appeared in the doorway, leaning lightly on her cane. Her eyes, though tired, shone with pride. "My brave girl," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "Go and show the world what an incredible woman you are." With tears in her eyes, Emily hugged her mother and sister, feeling their love and support like a protective shield around her. The conference hall of the Plaza Hotel was filled with some of the most powerful names in the business world. The buzz of conversation ceased when Richard Sterling entered, Emily by his side. All eyes turned to the couple, some curious, others calculating. Victor Lang watched from a corner, a smile of anticipation on his lips. He was ready to savor the moment when the great Richard Sterling would fall from grace. Richard walked up to the podium, the silence in the hall deafening. He looked at Emily, who nodded encouragingly, and then turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside, "I thank you all for coming today. Before we start the business discussions, there's something I need to share." A murmur went through the room. Victor leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Richard took a deep breath. "For years, I've built my career and my reputation on cunning strategies and often on half-truths. I convinced myself that the end justified the means. But recently, thanks to an extraordinary person, I learned the true value of honesty and integrity." He paused, his eyes meeting Emily's. "Emily Carter is not my fiancée. She was initially hired to play this role in an attempt to impress you and secure investment. The shock was palpable in the room. Exclamations of surprise and indignation echoed off the walls. Victor Lang couldn't contain his triumphant smile. But Richard continued, his voice gaining strength. However, what began as a farce turned into the most real and precious thing in my life. Emily showed me a world beyond numbers and contracts. She taught me about compassion, about family, about true love. Emily, with tears in her eyes, stepped forward to join Richard at the podium. "It's true," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I accepted this deal because my family was going through financial difficulties. I wanted to help them desperately. But along the way, I discovered that there are more important things than money. I discovered the importance of honesty, integrity, and yes, love." The silence that followed was heavy with judgment and uncertainty. It was then that an unexpected voice broke the tension. "Well, I think that's admirable." Everyone turned to see George Hawthorne, one of the most respected investors, standing there. "Sterling, you could have continued with this farce indefinitely, but you chose honesty, even though you knew it could cost you everything. That, to me, is worth more than any contract or number on a balance sheet." Others began to murmur in agreement. Margaret Hawthorne joined her husband. "And Emily, dear, you have shown a strength of character and a compassion that are rare in this world. Your honesty and your love for your family are inspiring." Victor Lang, watching his moment of triumph slip through his fingers, stepped forward. "You can't be serious. They tricked us. They lied to all of us." But his indignation fell on deaf ears. The investors, touched by Richard and Emily's honesty, began to express their support. Some even suggested increasing their investments, impressed by the new ethical direction Richard seemed to be taking. Victor, frustrated and furious, made one last attempt. "I have proof, documents that show the full extent of this fraud." It was then that the private investigator, who was standing discreetly at the back of the room, stepped forward. "Mr. Lang, I think you should be more careful with your accusations. During my investigation, I discovered some irregularities in your own business that I'm sure you wouldn't want to come to light." Victor's face paled and he retreated, defeated. The other investors, sensing the situation, quickly distanced themselves from him. In the midst of the whirlwind of emotions and reactions, Richard turned to Emily, taking her hands in his. "Emily," he said, his voice low but intense, "you've changed my life in ways I never imagined possible. I love you, not as part of a deal or a sham, but truly and deeply. Would you accept me, not as a powerful businessman, but as someone who is learning to be better because of you?" Emily, with tears flowing freely down her cheeks, smiled. "Richard, you changed my life too. You've shown me a world of possibilities. But more importantly, you've shown me that it's possible to be true to yourself even in the most difficult times. Yes, I accept you with all my heart." They hugged, ignoring the applause and murmurs around them. At that moment, they weren't the tycoon and the waitress. They weren't actors in an elaborate farce. They were simply Richard and Emily, two hearts that had found true love in the most unlikely of circumstances. In the months that followed, Richard and Emily faced challenges, of course. Rebuilding trust, both in business and in their relationship, wasn't easy. But together, they created something new and beautiful. Richard revamped his company with a new focus on social responsibility and business ethics. Emily, with Richard's support, created a foundation to help families facing medical difficulties, inspired by her own experience. On a sunny fall afternoon, they were married in an intimate ceremony in the Bronx with Emily's family and closest friends. Lily was the maid of honor, her face radiant with happiness for her sister. Sarah, Emily's mother, now recovered thanks to the medical care they were able to provide, blessed them with tears of joy. As they exchanged vows, Richard and Emily knew that their journey was far from over, but now they would face every challenge together with honesty, love, and the certainty that sometimes the best love stories start with a lie, but blossom with the truth. And so, under the golden New York sky, a new story began, not of lies and deceit, but of love, redemption, and the promise of a bright future built on the foundations of truth and mutual trust. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to like and subscribe to my channel. Your support motivates me to keep sharing exciting stories nearly every day. Don't miss the next amazing story that's about to unfold on your screen. I greatly appreciate your backing. Hope to see you soon.